Welcome to Designless. This is Tim.
And this is Zane.
This week we're going to be talking about what is good design.
That's a pretty big topic, Tim.
I believe that there are certain things that make design good design.
And I think I come from a more diverse background, so I like to look at it more holistically as what is the entire user experience from the design through the engineering and all that it encapsulates.
Well, I'll be the first to say that good design is not solely aesthetic. That it is all about a product being designed for how it will be used. If a product is designed well, it should tell you exactly how it should be used by how it looks. It should tell you whether it's fast, whether it's slow, whether it's meant to be something that's coddled or held, or something that's dangerous and should not be held. All of those things should be apparent in its form when you look at it and when you touch it. I think all of those kind of lead to someone understanding the product's place in the world and having it being well designed.
I mean, the way I think about that, right, it's kind of just a summary of what you just said is design should be intuitive. You know, anyone should be able to see something and know how to use it. And that goes from a baby, okay, maybe not that extreme, but a young child, to someone who's foreign, to someone who's international, to someone who's a elderly. It should fill the entire spectrum and make it that accessible.
Yeah, so I think we would both agree on that. So how does one determine if something is poorly designed? What is a poorly designed product?
Well, that's an interesting way to think about things. In my opinion, if a person has to spend time figuring it out, when it's not immediately obvious or it's conflicting to what they might assume how something functions, that's immediately not a good design, right? Because you're making it so that it takes more steps for someone to do what they want to do.
Yeah, so that's what I would refer to as like transparent design, right? If something is completely transparent, you can immediately begin using it without thinking about it. You don't have to learn a new type of writing to be able to use the product, or learn a new alphabet, or maybe even pick up the manual and read about how to interact with the product. It just immediately is apparent the minute you sit down to use it, and that's what we refer to as transparent design or transparent use.
So I think this conversation right now is a lot about user experience, right? But and maybe we have different approaches to how we start a project, but when I think about a new project that someone asks me to design, a new phone, a new vehicle, or new user interface, the question that I always start with, and this is kind of built off of my engineering, which is like, what is the design process, right? The question is, what's the problem that I'm solving? What is the need that I am actually trying to build a solution around? And so that to me is the core to my design process. And I think a good design answers this question, and it answers it in a way that is the simplest, most direct, and most intuitive way that we can produce this product.
Yeah, but the important thing is to recognize that also it doesn't just stop with, does this function well? That's where you start. The start is, what is the function? And then you need to move on beyond function to a product that is captivating and emotionally acceptable. I think it's funny, often that part's ignored. People tend to kind of treat the emotional aspects of products as less important. But most people do want to have an emotional connection with the products that they come in contact with daily if they're going to be purchasing it. And also, especially with large purchases like automobiles and homes, the emotional aspect of that purchasing process may actually happen before you logically justify the purchase. And so as a designer, we need to be aware that those emotional connections can happen very, very quickly through simple advertising or simply seeing the product. And it's those kind of emotional responses that actually lead people to want to interact with those things on a daily basis and end up purchasing them.
I totally agree that, I think emotion is an important value that we consider in the design of a product, but I also see it kind of in a different perspective, right? You can call it emotion, but I can also call it the human experience, right? The product has a human need, has a human factor to it. So what does that mean? It means that you're not building a box, right? We don't feel anything to that. Like, let's say a phone should not be a box. It has sharp corners. You don't necessarily want to put your hands around that. Whereas something that's more natural to us, that's shaped, that will fit into our hand, it is more desirable, but it's also a human factor that we want to react to that in a positive way.
Can a box be beautiful? Can a box be well designed?
Well, it depends on the use case, right? I think that's what I started with, is why are you using it? If you just say, can a box be beautiful or well designed, it's too open-ended for me to be able to answer that.
Well, but we have seen beautiful boxes designed over and over again by Apple. And Apple is constantly designing basically a box.
Well, so in my opinion, once again, I think this idea of beautiful doesn't mean good design. So if we're talking about beauty, that's a different conversation. But to me, it's about what is the specific need that you're trying to solve for, and whether it, actually intuitively does that.
Okay, so when I say beauty, I actually do mean good design. I think that beauty and good design actually go hand in hand. You can have something that's a good design that's also ugly, but if it's designed to be ugly and that's appropriate, then that is its own kind of beauty.
I think part of it that is the conflict that we might see in an industry is engineering can be very quantitative. It's a numerical solution. And then for design, we're really looking at the human psychology sometimes.
Yeah,
I mean, it's very qualitative, but the reason why I said psychology is because, so we're talking about these kind of nuances in the design. You can talk about the balance of the aesthetic, how does a highlight go, or how does the proportions of a product look. And so to someone who's not paying attention to this, it may seem like, why does that matter, right? Like this, it does the same function on its very core need. But let's say for a consumer, if you were to look at something that looks slightly off, and the human brain, there's a lot of things that we aren't consciously considering, but we do notice. It's like when you see and you're talking to someone who their eyes are, moving back and forth, they're not looking at you in the eye when you're having a conversation, deep down that there's something wrong with that person, right? They're lying to you maybe. And so there are these little micro gestures that we notice as humans. And so as designers, we're trying to consider these small psychological facets that do make an impact on our purchasing decisions or our adoption, whether we trust a product. And I think it's very hard to communicate that across. And because these aspects are very, I would say, because qualitative, right? They're hard to prove directly. There's no necessarily clear science for it. It becomes a very difficult case to demonstrate to fields that are more based in mathematics.
Yeah, it's more about the human experience and less about some mathematical formula. Although many people have tried to make mathematical formulas of beauty, the golden ratio, etc. The Greeks had a lot of mathematical formulas to describe what beauty was and good design. But I think as modern designers, we're looking more at what is the universal communication of what form will tell you. So, when you look at a pointy object, it looks dangerous. When you look at something that has really great surfacing, it looks fast, even when it's standing still. When we look at objects that are slightly asymmetrical, we have this bias to believe that they are less trustworthy or less good, or that they have some sort of parasitic infection or something. That, these are things that were built into us, into our limbic system from early man. And the way that we go about learning about the world is through these interactions with animals and plants and other people. And those actually affect our ideas of what products are and how those products should respond to our lives. So if we make cars that are asymmetrical, it is much harder to prove that those are good cars and trustworthy cars and strong cars and healthy cars and fast cars. And so that's why most cars are symmetrical and have a lot of attention put towards the proportions of the wheel to the length of the vehicle to the height of the vehicle. All of those proportions lead us to think about that vehicle in a different way, hopefully at like a stronger, more successful, healthier way, if that makes sense.
So I think, the part of the reason that Tim and I are talking about this question of what is good design is because it oftentimes is something we face in the workplace, right? When we're talking with different individuals who aren't necessarily specialists in design, it can appear to be very difficult to define this factor, right? And to prove why do we need to spend more time or more money to kind of tweak this shape or like perfect this form. And I think it goes back to kind of what Tim was saying just now and what I said at the very beginning, which is being able to define what is the actual need. Because I think for a designer, it's really important for them to be able to tell this story, right? To really showcase this is where our original goal is, and the reason why this product and this specific good design matters is because it does this, this, and this, leading all the way back to this original target of what is the fundamental need. And so you're really trying to tell a story that people who aren't familiar with design understand, right? Speak in their language a little bit while also demonstrating our kind of perspective on the product, and which will, at the end of the day, matter to the end user.
Yeah, there have been many cases where in my daily work, we'll talk about something being designed a certain way, and someone will say, well, why should we have to do that? This is, let's just get the baseline functionality and let's not spend extra time figuring out how to make this look appropriate. And sometimes that's okay. If you're designing a spacecraft or something, maybe the aesthetic portion of it, maybe its surfacing isn't quite as important. That's perfectly okay for a well-designed spacecraft. But in any object that has to kind of stand out in the market, where you're comparing two automobiles, two motorcycles to each other, a little bit of extra attention given to surfacing and form can make all the difference in your final bottom line in sales.
I think it still goes well beyond just aesthetics as well. Let's say, so today, there's the hardware side, there's the physical shape of an object, but there's also the user experience side, right? The interface maybe, or how someone interacts with a device. And I think good design considers all of these facets, because when you're talking about accessibility, for example, good design will consider this to make it the most intuitive experience so that more people can use it, so that someone who has a disability has the ability to use all the products that everyone else gets to use. And I think it's easy for many companies to go, okay, our primary target is the general audience, so it's a big enough. It's like 70% of the population is good enough, and then they will choose to exclude 30% because maybe the investment in developing that extra 30% is dramatically more expensive, right?
It is, yeah, typically.
But I think it's so important that we consider this facet, because I think good design should be available and accessible to as many people as possible. So it's about, when you're making an interface, you have to think, no, not just can I use it or can the general user use it, it's can all of these individuals use it? What are the specific circumstances? And really understanding and learning, empathizing for these different values. And that's very difficult because there's a lot of different cases.
So what I'm hearing you say is inclusive design also makes a good design.
Absolutely.
I agree. So what portion of good design do we disagree on? Is there an area?
I don't know. I from all of our conversation, what I notice is we have different vocabulary. We may even consider a different approach, but the core driving factors are very similar, whether you do look at it from a engineering perspective, a scientific perspective, or just a purely aesthetic or design perspective. So one thing that I think many people will consider is, can we quantify design? Is there a set of scientific rules that we can actually utilize? And I think potentially that may be the case hypothetically, but as of today, I don't know if there is one set of rules that you can just follow and you'll just magically have, a wonderful product.
Yeah, that's a really complex statement. Like, can we quantify good design? I don't believe that there's like a mathematical, scientific formula that you could create. Like, I remember I was going to college with a guy that wanted to make a program that would just basically take average inputs and turn them into great design. I don't know that that's possible. It would be really tough to program a program to create great design. But I believe that there are certain things that designers do on a regular basis, and maybe they just do them intuitively, that formulate great design. And a lot of those have to do, as I said previously, with observing nature and using the caricatures of nature to communicate about the design. There's a company called Divergent 3D where they basically take engineering hardpoints and they have this amazing program that will then overlay organic forms that basically follow all the structural necessities of that design, but also create these just amazingly gorgeous, mathematically beautiful, organic structures that are stronger, lighter, and better than what the human mind can come up with.
So just to clarify for our listeners, I think structural hardpoints, right? That's a concept of just meaning we are using engineering to define a key certain number of criterias, like, oh, it needs to have structure in these particular points, but everything in between, the space, the gaps, that's where this software can automatically kind of fill in, and right, this is where the designer has more leniency. And I think I really like this idea of these natural limiters, and that's one facet that I do think about, which is, so as a designer, yes, certain human behavior elements are very hard to quantify, right? Because it's constantly changing. It's a social thing, and it's never static. But there are other facets that are somewhat static, which is like our ergonomics, right? The human body can only do so much, and we know from tons of data and years and huge populations, we have certain numbers of, like, when you're seated in a certain position, these are the numbers that you're going to use. And as a designer, you follow those numbers because these are things that relatively will not change during our lifespan. But at the other side of the things is there's the human response to something. So you can make a chair that fits the person's body, but how they look at it and how they receive it is very different. If you're going to space in a spacecraft, you probably don't want something that makes you feel uncomfortable, gives you anxiety, right? So, and that's a human behavior element. And I don't know if you can necessarily quantify that.
There's so many steps in the design process. How does the designer ever get to a point where he feels like his design is good? Or how does he know if his design has reached goodness?
Yeah, I think the part of that is it's called scoping, right? And so when you start a project, like I said, we have these, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? You have an understanding of which scenario you're trying to solve. Like, you can't solve all the scenarios, right? If you're trying to make a product that helps, refrigerate food in what scenario? In a jungle, at home, right? These are all things that we need to comprehend. And so the idea of scoping is we're starting to limit down to a very specific set of variables, right? And then from there, we kind of understand this is the particular user scenario that we're using, the needs of each individual case. And from this, we kind of start setting ourselves up with a certain number of variables or kind of values that we're trying to meet. And so through this design process, we will keep these in mind, right? These are targets that we're constantly trying to meet or get closer to, and we're going to iterate on that until we get to what we think is a good design. Yeah,
so meeting like baseline goals, I think that's like the first step, right? I mean, that's what you have to do to make sure that you're meeting the criteria of the project. But I think that there are steps beyond meeting the criteria of the project that lead to good design. Often those criteria are built out. I mean, sometimes they're built out by the designer, right? Which is great. But often they're built out by some other person. It's either your client who happens to be a business person, or it's someone who happens to be the CEO. It's someone whoever hired you, but they aren't necessarily somebody who has the sensibility to create parameters that make good design. So what's the next step? What is it that leads to something that's better than baseline?
So, I mean, I think it's interesting. So, you could call it baseline. And I wasn't going into a lot of detail here, but, when you're making these criteria, you're considering the baseline criteria that you kind of mentioned, but you're also considering the criterion that the person in charge is demanding. But as a designer, it's also our job to understand the basic human needs in this scenario, right? Because our goal isn't to just kind of look at, we need to store food. It's like, why do we need to store food? We ask these kind of researcher questions to really deep dive into these basic needs. And if you're able to answer some of these needs or answer a combination of these needs, you're pretty much creating a good design, because it's very often that it's very difficult to meet all of these needs. It's like there's so many different parameters that are often contradicting, right? So it's like, I want this to be highly efficient, yet it stores this device and keeps it cold all the time, right? These are contradictory. So how does a design solve this problem? And if we're able to improve upon the existing market, you're already making a good design.
Yeah, so I think you're getting there. One of the things that I feel when I have a product that I feel is really well designed, I feel like whoever it was that designed that product was thinking about me. They were trying to anticipate whatever I would need using that product. I think of the UI on my phone. If that UI is anticipating my needs and putting the things that I'm looking for in places that are easy to find, I feel like that is well designed. When those things are hidden and they're like buried under some menu that I can't find, I feel like that person clearly wasn't thinking about whatever it was that I needed at that moment.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting because your original question was, how do we know what are our parameters to evaluate what is a good design as designers? And what you're describing is kind of the way that a user responds to the design, but that doesn't necessarily answer the question of how does the designer know? Because you wouldn't know if a user thinks, oh, this is exactly where I wanted it.
All right, so I'll answer my own question. It's testing. So I think you have to test that thing, right? Because you can't know that you've thought of everything as a designer. You can try as hard as you can. You can go through a number of iterative processes of designing and iterating and designing and iterating. But somewhere along there, you have to be testing, right? You have to be designing, iterating, testing, and then going back and redesigning. And if you're able to test often enough, there's always a limit to resources. There's always a limit to time. There's always a limit to money. There's always a limit to capability or expertise, etc. But if you are able to test often enough, it is much easier for a designer to get to what I view as like a good design. And that comes from watching different people use your object, and that helps you to anticipate how they might use it and what they might need it for.
Absolutely. I mean, I was assuming that this was almost, it was such a part of the process that I didn't even think of it, right? Because, of course, in order to create a product, you have to use the product, and testing is a part of the whole process, right? You're not, I'm going to create a whole thing and then testing at the end. It's every step of the way. We are constantly testing, iterating, and it's a continuous loop that almost never ends. And so when, if someone asks like, well, how do you know you get to the final great product? The answer is you don't, because you never finish the product. There's always something more to do, right? It's almost impossible that you'll ever find something that's like, there's nothing more I can change about this. And I truly believe it is a constant process that will keep innovating forever and ever.
So I think it is really easy for designers to kind of ignore the whole testing portion of the iterative design process. It's really easy to kind of just take that for granted. We all do it, and maybe we just don't think of it as being essential to the process. But testing is the only way that we can be sure that we're thinking of everything, because as designers, I think it's often too easy for us to think that just because it works for us, that it maybe works for everybody.
As a whole, to kind of summarize all of this idea of a good design, like what it really means, I think, is for, if you're a designer, your job is to be curious, to make sure you're constantly looking and trying to understand and, exploring as many facets as you can.
I think the concept of curiosity and good design are intrinsically connected. I think good design is something that actually makes us want to learn more. It makes us want to investigate something more. A well-designed product makes us interested. So good design is maybe something that drives our curiosity.
Yeah, and it's answering these human elements. So we're going to tie up this episode here, but if you want to hear more from us or have any specific topics that you'd like to hear about, please let us know once again in the comments or on our social media pages. And that's it for today. Thank you.